everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the Changing Church webinar. Hopefully these stories, as we're telling, got you warmed up, got you paying close attention. You'll want to use that in just a moment when I introduced our speaker, because it's going to be a warm and wonderful and insightful 45 minutes, I think, here in just a little bit. Before I do that, I want to thank all the partners that helped make this webinar a reality. We're very grateful for the good work of New Matrix. Their co-principals, Jim Kitchens and Deborah Wright, are on with us today, for the Church Network, for Truth Seminary and the Truth Church Network, for the Gardner Webb Divinity School, for Baptist News Global, and for the Lake Center for Faith and Giving. My name is Matt Cook, and I am the director of the Center for Healthy Churches, one more organization in this partnership that helps make this webinar a reality. The goal of this webinar is to ask and answer good questions that help ministers, congregations do the work that God is calling them to do. One of the things that we've been talking about a lot internally, both at New Matrix and at Center for Healthy Churches, is now that, not that the pandemic is over with, I mean, still people are getting sick occasionally, they're being diagnosed, but I had this conversation. I was in Nashville this week working with 18 churches as part of a Lilly grant at Belmont University, and we asked a number of our pastors, how much is the pandemic impacting what you do? And what they said was, it's not impacting the way that we schedule things, but it's still impacting me. It's still something that I'm carrying with me. I'm still living in the aftermath of that stress and anxiety and all of the demands, the different demands that created. With that idea in mind, a few weeks ago, we came up with this idea of talking about what is it like to be in ministry? What is it like to lead our congregations, many of whom have this idea that we're going to restart the engines and things are going to get back to normal. How do we do that, though, when our tanks are still empty? So we're calling this series, How to Put Your Foot on the Gas When Your Tank is Empty. Over the next few weeks, starting today, we're going to get several different answers to that question. And I'm excited about the fact that the person that's going to start us off with that is somebody whose wisdom that I count on a lot to ask, to answer really good questions. Guy Sayles is the retired pastor of the First Baptist Church of Asheville, North Carolina. He has taught at Mars Hill College. He is a consultant with the Center for Healthy Churches, among a number of other things that he has done. He's a person full of a lot of wisdom. So, Guy, we're delighted to have you with us today. Delighted to hear what you have to share with us. And with that said, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Matt. And I'm glad to see everybody and glad to have this chance to be in conversation with you. I love the theme that you all came up with, pressing on the gas when you're running on empty yourself. And it occurred to me as I thought about this topic that we're also pressing on the gas when we're not quite yet sure how fast we can go, how wise it is, how safe it is to go at what particular speed, and when we don't really know for sure where we're going. So we've got some questions in addition to the emptiness question. And I agree that COVID is affecting our congregations in different ways. But just as an example, though, I got a call yesterday from the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church here in Asheville, and he has COVID and his whole staff has been exposed to COVID. So I'm going to be pinch hitting for him on Sunday because they wanted somebody completely outside that circle of exposure to be sure that somebody'd be able to show up to preach. So anyway, we're being still being affected by COVID, but in different ways. But I do think that the most significant challenge for those of us who try to offer leadership in different ways is what I would think of as a kind of paradoxical set of feelings we have. As I reflect on my own experiences and as I work with other leaders, what I'm struck by is we have this sort of paradoxical set of emotions that are in tension with each other. There's both a sense of despair and futility on the one hand, and hope and optimism on the other. And it's not either, it's both. There's some sadness and grief that linger, and there's some joy that also emerges. Frankly, there's some ignorance we have. There's a lot we don't know, and there's some insight we're gaining. And I keep thinking about that little phrase that Paul uses in 2 Corinthians 4 when he says we're afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. So how do we lead when we have this paradoxical set of emotions and feelings? And especially, how do we lead when among those feelings are fatigue, loneliness, and emptiness? And I want to come at this by offering some gleanings from what might seem a strange source, but I want to just offer some of what I have gleaned from my ongoing experience of having cancer and being in ongoing treatment for it, because it strikes me that there's a rough analogy between dealing with chronic illness and dealing with the circumstances we are facing just now. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on the history of this, but in 2014, early 2014, I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, which is a cancer of the blood and bone marrow. It has diverse effects on people. Primarily for me, the effect has been significant bone pain and fatigue. The illness itself is incurable, but thanks to some advances in treatment, it's more manageable than it was when I was diagnosed. When I was diagnosed, the median life expectancy was 5 years, and I'm at 8 now, and very grateful for that. The cancer and the treatment leave me dealing on a regular basis with this pain and fatigue. Sometimes the pain flares significantly, or the fatigue deepens to a great degree, and I'm sidelined for a few days when that happens. But that doesn't happen as often as it used to. Again, something for which I'm grateful. So here are just a few things that I have had to learn and I'm still learning. And one of those is that I'm not ever going to experience life again apart from pain and fatigue and treatment. I take an oral chemotherapy pill every day. I have an infusion once a month. I have predictable negative side effects from those treatments, and I deal with these ongoing realities that I've already named. It's not likely that I will live long enough to benefit from whatever cure might be discovered. So I've had to decide that I can't defer life and calling until I'm somehow past the challenges, traumas of this experience. And I think there's a rough analogy for what we're dealing with as a culture and what we may be dealing with as leaders. We're not going to go back to a time before these experiences and their effects on us. And we're not likely to be able to completely work past them in time to be effective in our congregations. So, like Jacob, I'm not going to walk without a limp. Like Paul, I'm going to have a thorn in the flesh. So I want to try to simply offer you some things that I have learned from this cancer. I was talking with a social worker, a therapist, about 5 years into this experience. And she asked me, Guy, do you ever wonder what your life would be like if you hadn't gotten cancer? And before I could think and edit myself, I said, well, I wouldn't want to be without cancer, Carrie. And then I said, no, wait, that's not what I mean. What I mean is, I wouldn't want to be without what cancer has taught me, though I would have been willing to learn another way. And so here are some of those lessons. And they're all familiar to you. I'm just reminding you of things you already know out of my experience. Invulnerability and control are illusions. We're all vulnerable to something. We're all vulnerable to something that will, in some ways, limit us and inhibit us. Control is an illusion. We can have some proximate control, some temporary control, but we can't completely control the circumstances of our lives, and certainly not the circumstances of our congregations or our culture. And that means that predicting what's going to happen is also an illusion. We can make our best guesses, but we're not going to have any reliable predictions. What we can do, rather than living with the comfort of illusory predictions, is prepare ourselves to live with whatever might occur. So that's one thing. Invulnerability and control are illusions. And so is the idea that we are or can be independent of one another. We affect each other, we need each other, whether we like it or not. I've been struck by how, since this cancer journey began for me, I have essentially put myself in the hands of people who have done invasive, serious things to my body. And I hardly know these people. But I have had to entrust myself into their hands. I have taken into my body chemical agents that I just have to trust someone has vetted to be both effective and safe enough, at least, for me to take. In other words, I have had to depend on people, many of whose names I don't know. And I'm affected by them in ways that I never would have imagined. Related to this idea is that I have had to ask for help. I remember early in this journey, I wrote a letter to some friends because I left the pastorate of First Baptist Church in Asheville not knowing what I was going to do. I just knew that I couldn't continue to pastor the church in the way it needed to be pastored. So I resigned. I was only 59 years old. I didn't have any idea what I was going to do for a living or what kind of health insurance I might have. So I wrote a letter to a few people, and the first words of it were, "I need your help." And I showed that letter to my friend Mahan Sayles before I sent it out. And Mahan read that phrase, "I need your help," and he took the letter and placed it face down on the table between us. We were at Barnes and Noble having coffee. And he said, "When people read that line, Guy, they're going to look down at the signature twice to see if it's really from you. Because I just heard you say something in this letter I've never heard you say before, which is, I need your help." And it occurs to me that part of the response to leading in a time like this is our ability to say appropriately and honestly to the right people, I need your help. I cannot do this alone. Another thing I have learned is that fatigue, loneliness, and emptiness are more of a threat to our emotional, spiritual, and physical well-being than we ever imagined. So when we're asking each other, how do we lead when we are feeling empty, we're asking a really profound existential and theological question. Because emptiness and its cousin, fatigue, are actually, I think, theological categories. We are different people than we hope to be and want to be when we're empty and weary. One of the most insightful articles I read about the pandemic was written by a South Korean scholar named Chai Han. And he simply entitled it The Tiredness Virus. And in it, one of the things he said was that part of the cruel irony of what this disease has done to us is that it has revealed that we reach a place sometimes in life where we're not able to will ourselves to be able. We're not able to will ourselves to be able. And I think that's a profound insight. And the emptiness we feel, the fatigue we feel, can eat away at our will, our power to make ourselves act. And I see leaders who are past the capacity to will themselves into action. And then I think that we have recognized that there is a tiredness that mere physical rest cannot cure. Because we need rest for our minds and rest for our hearts and rest for our emotions. And I want to encourage us to take that seriously. We do have to lead and press on the gas. And at the same time, we have to find ways to tend to the emptiness we feel. And I'm going to quit talking in just a minute and engage in whatever conversation you'd like to. But let me just offer a few suggestions based on my experience that I hope will be helpful to people who are trying to lead on empty. And here's one of them. You are in charge of your care. One of the things I had to learn about the medical system is that none of the specialists I was dealing with, nor my internist, were actually looking at me as a whole person. They were either looking at me as my spinal fluid or my blood samples or my blood pressure or whatever. No one was looking at me as a whole person. That was my job. That is my job. And I had to take responsibility for my own care, translated into a leader's experience. It's not likely, I wish it were, but it's not likely that anyone else is going to manage your care for you. If you're going to find the care you need to deal with fatigue and emptiness and loneliness, the initiative for finding that care and practicing that care rests with you. I know that many of us have people around us in our congregations who encourage us to care for ourselves, and they also presume that they are exceptions to our need to be away if they need us. No one else is going to manage your care for you or be sure that you get the care that you need. And related to that is that your experience is valid even if nobody else understands it, and even if you can't explain it to them. Your feelings, your condition, your circumstances are valid for you, even if others can't understand them. So that's one thing. You're in charge of your care. Another thing is to practice what Kristen Neff calls self-compassion. You know, to be as kind to yourself as you would be to others, to be gentle with yourself, to acknowledge your common humanity, to be mindful of the choices you make. Another suggestion I would make is to assemble some sort of support and accountability community for yourself. I don't think I realized how much it is the case that hope is a relational and communal experience as much as it is, and perhaps before it is, an individual experience. Hope and joy depend on community and relationship, and we all need a small group of people with whom we can be honest and vulnerable about what we're experiencing. I don't think a leader can do that with everybody, but a leader needs to do it with somebody, a small group of people with whom you can be real. And then I think the most important thing, I have more to say, but I'll stop. The most important thing is to have a regular practice of centering or recentering yourself in your essential identity. The essential identity as a beloved child of God in whom God takes delight. I have been tempted to let my identity get absorbed by pain, or absorbed by fatigue, or absorbed by cancer, and to let that swallow up the greater identity. But the greater identity is that no matter what happens, we are beloved children of God, and nothing can separate us from that love. I'll stop there and just see what kind of conversation we might engage in.
So Jim Kitchens asked a question, I'll get to it in a second, and I will invite other people to do that as well. So please feel free to use the chat feature to pose some questions to Guy. I'm not sure I think this is a good question, Guy, but when you were talking about in the experience of receiving chemo, placing your life in the hands of people who you don't even know their name, that hit me, like that, the vulnerability of that and the strangeness of that hit me. I'm wondering, have you mined that? Obviously that's a strange experience to go through. Have you mined that for, like, is there other fruit emerging out of that you're carrying forward in terms of wisdom for life? Talk about that some more, if you don't mind.
It's a great question, Matt. And part of what that experience is continuing to teach me is that, despite and alongside, because it is true, despite and alongside the polarization and division and animosity of our culture, where we feel like we can't trust ourselves into the hands of people that we don't know, it is true that beneath and beyond that rhetoric, there are webs of people who genuinely care for strangers, because I'm a stranger to them as well. And so this idea that I was a stranger and you welcomed me, is a powerful thing to me, because I'm often a stranger, or I am called upon to welcome strangers into my life. I have gotten to know some of these people, but I didn't know them at all when I first started that care. So it's enriching my sense that there are healthy bonds that unite us, despite all the rhetoric and reality of division in our culture, and it is true that we are seamlessly woven together, for good or for ill. But in this case, I'm seeing a lot of the good that exists there, and it's enriching for me.
Jim asked the question, and he noted that you went on to answer it in some ways, but I'll pose it to give you an opportunity to go deeper if you want to. How important is it to have at least one person with whom you can most fully share your whole self in the midst of whatever thing you're carrying?
It's absolutely critical, and I would say that it is, in addition to a partner or a spouse that you share life with, because he or she, they are also dealing with the effects of what's happening to you. And, no matter how good a relationship is, it can't always bear the burden of that. So, and there have been times when it's been a spiritual director or a therapist or a trusted friend, but I think it's absolutely essential to have somebody who can both offer support and, frankly, some accountability, because one of the temptations of chronic pain and fatigue, or chronic problems of the kind we deal with as leaders, is we can either minimize it or exaggerate it. We can either minimize the problem we face and therefore not deal with it wisely, or we can exaggerate it and be limited by it. And having someone who can offer us perspective is crucial.
So one of the things that I've been thinking about, and I don't have a good answer to, and maybe you will, is I'm struck by what you said. Stop it. What I wrote down was, stop expecting an old normalcy to return. That we live, whatever we're dealing with is the normalcy to a certain extent. You had said we have to be careful about always vocalizing, these are my words, and verbalizing our burden that we're carrying in front of the entire congregation. And yet at the same time, part of what we're dealing with is a way that the church itself, the systems of the church, are also stressed and dealing with things, and maybe failing to recognize that what the system is dealing with is itself a new normalcy. How do we walk the line between helping the congregations that we are a part of name rightly the larger context in which we're all operating, and the particular challenges that it's creating for us as individuals?
I do think it's important for us to name the realities that individuals and the community deal with. What I'm aware of is that it's a tricky tension that leaders face. If we make our conversation about what we experience too much about what I experience, then it reinforces our place as the projector screen for the congregation, and it enables people who choose to make our articulation of our pain the problem. If you could just get past what you're dealing with, we'd be fine. So I think raising questions, telling stories, naming realities is really important. And I think occasionally including our experience in that is a good thing. I think but occasionally, not frequently.
Yeah.
The old Henry Nouwen wounded healer thing, kind of a working principle I have is it's fine to talk about your woundedness after you've experienced enough healing. That the narrative is wounds can be healed, not I'm wounded, take care of me.
Okay. Bill Owen asked the question, Bill, if I get this, I hope I get this as you intended. What I assume he's asking is, given what you've verbalized for us today, what you've learned in this experience, if you could take that, pick it up and take it back to your life 10, 15 years before you were diagnosed and you were pastoring, what would you do differently as a result? So
I would, because I have learned how really true it is that independence, rugged individualism are actually insidious and dangerous. I would nurture more than I did a genuine community of conversation between clergy and lay leaders in the church. I would talk more often and sooner about the challenges we face, rather than falling for the idea that it was my job to come up with a solution and then sell it to leaders. I would have much more, many more what we might now call adaptive conversations with leaders and say, here's what I see coming. How can we approach that? It would be a much more communal approach to leadership than I exercised, because the way I exercised leadership was what I thought was expected. In fact, it was expected. But the idea that one or a few people have enough wisdom to deal with all the unpredictability and change that's an illusion too. So that would change. And I would also, this may seem odd, it was one of the things on my list, I would not break the Sabbath commandment as often as I did. I would find ways to be sure that I rested my mind and body and heart before I got to the place of being exhausted and empty. And I didn't do that as often or as well as I should and could.
So I have found myself saying that almost word for word, that line that you said to the person when you talked about, I wouldn't not have cancer, that part of what you shared, having lost a child and having lived on the other side of that experience. In some ways, I think maybe you've already answered this question, but I want to give you an opportunity to maybe focus it specifically on COVID. So COVID's not a blessing. What we've gone through is not a blessing. We can't minimize the loss of life. We can't minimize the impact. But if I asked you to posit what the blessing for the church might be, the broken blessing of the church that COVID has been and continues to be, what might you suggest to us?
Well, it's definitely it's a painful blessing, and what I'm about to say, a lot of others have said, but I think COVID accelerated and deepened some of the crises we were already experiencing, and I think what we've seen is that, to use the analogy of the foundation, that the foundations on which we were building church life were seriously flawed and broken already. And so a gift in this, as we, to continue that construction analogy, rebuild, is to recognize that it's not wise to rebuild on that same foundation. We've got some real reinvestigation, I think, to do about what is essential for congregations in our time. And I think what's essential is a lot less than we imagine in terms of activity. and a lot more in terms of simplicity, community, celebration, engagement. But I think it's less program and more relational. And so I think it's given us a chance to see that in ways that it would have taken us maybe another 10 or 15 years in some places to see.
Yeah, it strikes me. So in the 21st century, unlike in the 20th century, a lot of the big moments in the 20th century were challenges that we met and overcame.
Right. And
in the 21st century, they are smaller scale challenges, but challenges that don't conclude.
Yeah.
So, the what happened at 9/11, while we responded to that, the risk that goes along with the world that operates in that way has not gone anywhere. The financial outflow of the Great Recession, while we got past it in some ways, we continue to be kind of financially at risk as a nation, as a culture. Certainly the pandemic has not left us, and we're being told it may never leave us, that it's the new flu and maybe is a worse version of the flu. I'm interested in, I'm wondering how that living in the uncertainty itself, not just the pandemic, that's one example of it, how that itself, what are we supposed to mine from that? What are we supposed to take away from that as ministers in congregation? And that itself, the decline in the institutional church, another one that is not, we haven't overcome it. It has not gone away. It's not going away.
Yeah.
What would you say in terms of not just responding to the pain and the loneliness and the fragmentation, but the uncertainty that is the larger context in which all that is happening?
Yeah, and Matt, I think this is probably only a partial answer to what you're asking, but I have this growing intuition that this is a time for us to revisit the handful of things that we know are certain in the face of all this uncertainty. It may be that the best ministry of the church right now, both internally and beyond itself, is to say what we do know more creatively and more winsomely, and I mean very foundational things like nothing can separate us from the love of God. There is the capacity for love in the face of fear. It is possible to have hope alongside despair. Those basic gospel truths. I think we're in need of reaffirming those, not instead of other things, but as the center and core of other things. And I mean, this is a bunny path we don't have time to go down. I think part of what we're seeing with the disintegration of what some of us have known as the evangelical part of the church, but it may have other expressions in more mainline settings, is a failure of precisely that kind of Christian nurture and formation. I mean, we went into this season, not just a pandemic, but political and civil unrest and racial reckoning and all that, with people who weren't ready to respond as followers of Jesus Christ to these challenges. And there's work to be done there.
Yeah.
With those that remain.
And work to underscore your point, work that is less about the particular expression of the issue that is where the disintegration is manifesting, than the underlying call to love God and love neighbor, and that God loves us.
Right. Exactly. I mean, exactly. It's at the heart of it. Yeah.
So Jim asked about what would look for a community, a congregation to have a service of confession around the ideas that you're talking about now, really a service of healing. You wrote a little bit about lament as a practice a few weeks ago along those lines. You might want to pick up on some of that too. talking about worship, but what would communal practices of response look like in this moment?
I do think that both services that include both lament and celebration, both of grief and gratitude are crucial. And at one time I thought services of lament and healing ought to exist sort of on their own, apart from giving thanks and celebrating and all that. But I think that sets up the idea that life can be either one or the other. And I think life is always both. So I think giving ourselves, our congregations, the chance to name pain, to express frustration, anger, grief about it, and at the same time to notice those places where grace is manifest, where good happens alongside pain. I think all that is critical. And I think the more specific to the local community, the better. So to name pain in general, the million deaths of the pandemic, yes, but to name the people we have lost to the pandemic, to name gratitude for vaccines and doctors, but then to name the healthcare people in our church, our community. I think specificity matters here. I think specificity opens us to healing. And by the way, on lament, we're talking about lacking energy and feeling empty. There is latent energy that we need in our grief and in our anger, and naming it and saying it and putting it to use may be a source of untapped energy for us. Anger is a kind of energy. It can be volatile, but it can also be channeled. And we may have bottled up energy inside of us with our unexpressed grief, anger, and frustration. We might find a lot of release and power if we were able to name it in a community that validated it for us, instead of telling us to rush past it.
I was about to head for the exits, but that last statement, maybe at least for me, is too profound for me to stop. So what would that look like? So, and especially about grief, I get the anger, like that one makes more sense to me. I've immediately have an experience that I can call on of I was angry, and you're right, there was energy, and if I knew how to channel it right, it would go somewhere. But about grief, you have any idea what that what would that look like, Guy?
Well, it would look a lot less constrained and structured communally than most of our let's just say it this way, than most of our funeral services, for example. There might actually be some tears, some actual wailing, if not in a communal worship, at least in a small circle of people where we're able to say, I've sustained this loss and it's real and it hurts. And I feel bereft and lonely and afraid. I've been amazed that where genuine grieving happens, there is an opening then, an opening for joy, not instead of grief, but alongside grief. This occasionally happens at the meal after the funeral. People gather, it's kind of solemn, but if they stay together long enough and tell stories long enough, it's not going to be long before you're going to hear uproarious laughter. And I think we need some of both. There's energy in that.
That feels like a good note to end on. Not that we deny our grief, not that we pretend like it's not real, not that we have to shove it to the side because the calendar's gone on long enough that we think we're supposed to pretend like everything's normal, but instead it is real, but there might even be ways for us to harness the joy that can come alongside it, the life that we are reminded of in the midst of sometimes of pain and suffering. So thank you, God, very much, as always. So next week, Ayanna Teeter is going to, also one of our team, part of both New Matrix and the Center for Healthy Churches, is going to come, and she's going to provide her own answer to the question. So we'd love to have you back as we continue. Our hope, again, is not to necessarily break brand new ground every week, but to have overlapping answers to the question that we hope speaks life into you, even as you and your congregations continue to kind of go through these moments that we've described earlier. So thanks to Guy for his wisdom today. We'd love to see you next week. Everybody have a great week.